Alrighty, let's begin. Then, if anybody else joins midway, I'll just put some information in the group chat. Hi everyone, thank you for being here today. For any newcomers, my name is George Palau, and I'm Cornell's Federalist Society president. We have a very special day today, a very special event over Zoom with Victoria Dorfman from Jones Day. But before we go further, I'd just like to say that if you are a Cornell Law student, we are giving out DoorDash credit tonight if you have your cameras on, and this is a great way of ensuring some engagement. So that will be given out at the end of this event, and it will also expire at the end of today. So make sure you use it. And with all speaker events, there will be a Q&A at the end. So, if you have any questions for Ms. Dorfman, feel free to raise your hand towards the end, or you can also write in your question in the Q&A towards the end. Lastly, I'm not going to kick off the introductions because I'm going to hand it off to somebody else, the person who really started this event from the outset before he unfortunately transferred, but he remains a very good friend of the chapter. So take it away, Christian.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. And thank you, Victoria, for joining us. I want to read the official bio, and then I just want to mention why I think this talk is interesting and important. But first, we'll say Victoria Dorfman is a partner at Jones Day, where she represents clients in appellate and complex commercial litigation in U.S. courts, from bankruptcy on up through the Supreme Court and in international arbitration. She recently joined the Washington office of Jones Day after spending 10 years in the firm's New York office. Victoria's areas of experience include jurisdiction, civil procedure, arbitration, wide range of experiences, and she maintains an active First Amendment establishment and free exercise practice representing religious institutions. Before Jones Day, Victoria clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas on the U.S. Supreme Court and Judge Michael J. Ludig of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Victoria received her AB from Harvard College and JD from Harvard Law School, where she was articles, books, and commentaries editor for the Law Review. She's a native speaker of Russian, proficient in French and Portuguese, and has published numerous articles. And so the reason that I am thrilled to have Victoria talking with us here is because law deeply structures our societies. And I think there's an enormous degree of attention paid at every level, at the Supreme Court level, at the level, especially at Cornell with the wonderful LLM community and so on comparative law, and people looking at the importance of comparative law. But rarely ever do we consider the comparative law of failed legal systems like that of the Soviet Union. And so, Marxism, Leninism structured so much of the law of the Soviet Union and the USSR. Soviet constitutions were in significant part about social ownership of property, which, induces tragedy of the commons at every level. And so the Soviet legal system structured in terms of, I don't want to foreclose anything that's going to be in the talk, but they had different titles of law, criminal law, property law, civil law, different titles of law that were established in a kind of top-down way analogous to the French and German system. But as far as I'm concerned, the single defining feature, again, was the linchpin of Marxism, Leninism, of social ownership of property. And so I hope, again, we'll be able to discuss how much more significant this is than any of the little movements and doctrines or meta-doctrines related to the administrative state or civil procedure within the United States. I think people say Mallory versus Norfolk Southern was the most important decision of the last term. I think that the significance of the thousands of talks that have been given on Mallory versus Norfolk Southern actually pales in comparison to talking about the fundamental structure of societies, which I hope is what we're going to discuss or at least touch upon in this talk. So I'm thrilled to introduce Victoria Dorfman. Thank you.
George and Christian, thanks so much for this introduction. Happy to be here, happy to talk about former Soviet Union. It is, as you see, this talk is not going to go through various laws, but how the structures of that society actually made society as dysfunctional as it was. And as you will see, it touched every aspect of people's lives in extremely negative ways. So Just a disclaimer, the opinions are my own. Obviously, by way of background, I was born in Odessa, Ukraine, when Ukraine was just one of 15 republics of the Soviet Union. My family left the Soviet Union in 1989 and we came over to the United States. I personally lived through the rules of Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev. If not all names are familiar, I'll be doing a brief history recap. The reason why I wanted to talk about, I prepared this talk after actually I was talking to Leonard Leo about my experience living in the Soviet Union and my family's. And, as we were discussing, many people, especially you guys, if your generation, you were born or raised after that country was defunct, but so many ideas persist. And so it's important to know what the implementation of those ideas actually meant for people on everyday level. So they do not just appear as some ideals and abstractions that need to be implemented again. So why socialism? It's because the ideas remain popular, especially to very young people. People think, equality as was implemented in the Soviet Union, perhaps is a great idea. But the reality, of course, it was not achieved and it was anything but. And those who never lived under socialism have no idea how detrimental are restrictions on private property and how they led to an economic decline. And then third is an indispensable part of life under socialism was one party controlling everything, from sources of information to your education, to employment, to place of living, to your leisure. And so there are three parts to my talk. I want to give some historical background. Then I'm going to do day in life that would illustrate various aspects of socialism in the USSR. And then go through those aspects in a more systematic way. Obviously, on historical background alone, there are entire sections of a library devoted to each event. So this is a very cursory summary. Okay, so you guys can see slide 2, right? Communist Manifesto? Yes, great. So Marx and Engels published their Communist Manifesto in 1848. They spoke of alienation of workers from their work by being a commodity paid low wages in competition with one another. They also talked about alienation from means of production because those owning means of production were capturing all the surplus. They documented the condition of workers in Western Europe and expected communism to come in countries with advanced capitalist systems. And Marxists often refer to socialism as the first necessary phase on the way from capitalism to communism. Their solution was collective ownership of the means of production. Seeing the condition of the proletariat, which are workers, their view was that the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win, and so they appeal to all the workers of the world to unite. The last bit, Workers of the World Unite, has been popularized around the world by the Soviet Union and its propaganda efforts. Russia, interestingly, was not on the list at all because it barely moved away from serfdom. Serfdom, as some of you know, is peasants were attached to the land. They were not slaves, but fairly close to that. And there was hereditary ownership of serfs by lords. And definitely not into mature capitalism, as it was not even industrialized. So the Russian road to the revolution, revolutions, plural, from the time of Communist Manifesto to the actual communist revolution was mostly through the absolutist monarchy of 3 czars you see here. The Imperial Russia failed through the 19th and 20th century to modernize its archaic social, economic, and political structures while maintaining the stability of an autocratic monarchy. Although serfdom was formally abolished in 1861, many of its after effects remained. By 1914, when World War I started, only 40% were industrialized workers, and they were laboring away in very poor conditions. So then World War I started, and it brought serious shortages, resulting in bread riots and also desertion of many soldiers. And while peasants and workers were continued to be cruelly mistreated, and political activists were spreading Western democratic ideas and raising class consciousness, there was actually some advancement, and that resulted in the February bourgeois democratic revolution. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and he was replaced by the provisional government, which sought to create a democratic assembly and usher some reforms. So that was definitely an attempt to address all the problems that were facing Russia at the time, but they were not nearly enough given the turmoil of the country, including its internal problems and the drain caused by World War I. So then Vladimir Lenin was not part of that provisional government, but rather a Bolshevik, a fraction representing mostly workers. With clever political maneuvering, he led the October Revolution and proclaimed that the Communist Party would act on behalf of the people. There was a great deal of idealism that was being pushed, such as electrification of the country, because people were using candles. And in fact, it was very popular to name girls as elektrifikace, which is electrification in Russian. They also pushed for literacy, which is not surprising because less than 40% of males could read and about 12% of females, etc. And Lenin declared that without literacy, there can be no politics, there can only be rumors, gossip, and prejudice. But although the ideas seem pretty great, we want people to be able to read, all of this was done through violence, including brutal civil war. In addition, and that's a recurring theme, there was seizure of all property and transfer to the Communist Party or collectives. And in a period known as Red Terror, Bolshevik secret police, known as Cheka, carried out a campaign of mass executions against supporters of the Tsarist regime and against Russia's upper classes. So, but things were not going well. Obviously, these are not the methods that result in, more food or more industrial output. And the workers' paradise was not happening. So Lenin decided to switch gears a bit and introduce new economic policy, allowing some minor free enterprise. So that was the concession to non-workability of his ideals. But Lenin passed away in 1924. His body is preserved in a mausoleum on the Red Square of Moscow, and his ideas were then changed quite a bit. What you get thereafter is Stalin takes over, he tightens the screws and makes it a truly horrific totalitarian state where terror reigned. So if you read 1984 by Orwell, that's pretty much what life was there. People were sent to prison for no reason whatsoever, to uranium mines. Anonymous accusations abound. People were forced to basically report on each other at the threat of death. It was total terror. Stalin institutes purges, getting rid of those with knowledge and expertise. And why does he do that? Partly it was to exterminate his enemies, because many came from educated families, and that was a huge black mark. Partly because of paranoia, and partly to create cadres that would be loyal to him and implement his policies. The picture on the right is Stalin with a girl named Engelsina, which is the derivation of Engels, and whose parents were actually high up in the Communist Party. But since the picture was taken, they were subject to purges and they were dead. Nonetheless, the picture was used very widely within the Soviet Union in schools, in pioneer camps, and the government pretended that it was just a child who worked as a cotton picker in Tajikistan. So just shows you the absurdity of that regime. But with multiple rounds of purges, the guardians are gotten rid of as well in turn. And one person's death is a tragedy and thousands or millions are a statistic. And although Stalin said it in the context of World War II opening the second front in France, that was his attitude towards the population. Stalin transformed the Soviet Union from an agrarian society to an industrial and military power. He implemented a series of 5-year plans to spur economic growth. They advanced industrialization and enforced collectivization in the agricultural sector. So that means that rural peasants were all forced to join collective farms. Those who owned land or livestock were stripped of their holdings. Hundreds of thousands of higher income farmers were executed and their property confiscated. The party believed that consolidating individually owned farms into a series of large state-run collective farms would increase agricultural productivity. Well, guess what? The opposite was true. In Ukraine, for instance, the place traditionally with great agricultural output, there was a famine that killed estimated 13% of the population. And subsequent 5-year plans focused on the production of armaments and military buildup. So World War II, with Hitler attacking the Soviet Union in 1941 after having signed a non-aggression pact in 1939, was the rallying moment for the country. Stalin used appeals to Russia as a motherland to get war efforts going. Note that some of the communist rhetoric was entirely dropped in favor of old-fashioned patriotism of Russia itself. Of course, anyone who sought to evade their duties was shot, so the only way was forward. About 24 million people perished. There were incredible deprivations during and in the name of the war. You see on the left, Stalingrad, and after the decisive battle that lasted from August 1942 till February 43, which halted the advance of Germans into the Soviet Union and started series of victories of the Soviet army. The one on the right is the Soviet army putting a red flag on the Reichstag in Berlin in 1945. In 1953, which was the year of Stalin's death, Khrushchev had the courage of criticizing what was going on. Everyone at the top of the party was sufficiently scared by Stalin's terror that such harsh methods were abandoned because everybody lived in absolute fear of what was going to happen to them at any moment or to their families. No matter how high up you were in Politburo, in the party, there were no guarantees. They can haul you to prison or to just shoot you like right there with your family at any point. So Khrushchev Khrushchev abandoned those methods, and those who remained after the purges embraced kind of more humane governance. Khrushchev tried to also make socialism better for people and promised to overtake United States in consumer production shortly. You will see on the slide the construction of high-rises to provide housing for the population, a problem that was never adequately addressed even through 1980s until the Soviet Union fell. But overtaking the US in consumer goods was impossible for a couple of reasons. A lot of resources were allocated towards the military, given the Cold War and the space program. Here is the slide of Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, and he's lauded as the son of the party. And you can see the posters where it says fairy tale becomes reality and glory to the son of the party. Otherwise, there was lack of infrastructure and lack of incentives to produce consumer goods. The party came up with high numbers, often disconnected from the reality of production, and people on the ground fudged the statistics. And Red Plenty, which is on this slide, is an excellent book about planning failures in the USSR. After Khrushchev was kicked out to a dacha, a summer house, which was a tremendous progress. So he was not shot, he was not sent to prison, he didn't disappear, he just was relieved of his command. Brezhnev took over. There was still no freedom of ideas, and KGB, the secret police, was monitoring everything, which you guys might be familiar with what Stasi was doing in East Germany, so all inspired by the KGB. But unless one engaged in active agitation, one was not going to be executed. So that already was a big relief to people. But overall, there was just economic stagnation, and whatever resources the state had, they were diverted towards the military and propping up USSR-friendly regimes around the country, around the globe, to maintain sphere of influence. There were also repressions, but not nearly to Stalin's level. After Brezhnev, there were two party leaders, Andropov and Chernenko, and they died in quick succession. Then Gorbachev came to power, recognizing the stagnation and increasing dissatisfaction of the population, which people felt a bit more free to express because at least they knew they were not going to be shot on the spot. He introduced glasnost and perestroika. They were aimed at economic reforms and very, very limited political openness. And this limited experiment eventually got out of hand, and the Soviet Union collapsed sometime after the Berlin Wall fell. So in sum, living in the Soviet Union, there was only one employer, one source of goods, and one source of information, which is the state headed by the Communist Party. So what I'd like now is to talk about day in the life of our family in somewhat free artistic terms, and then it will illustrate many of the themes that then I'm going to cover in greater detail. So imagine it's Saturday sometime in the fall, and election day is coming up in the Soviet Union. Everybody knows about it. Even though there is only one candidate per position, the election activities are significantly shaping my mother's day, who has special responsibilities as a teacher. She worked as a French teacher in school, towards voter turnout. There are also elections coming in the United States, but the information of how elections are conducted in the capitalist West are entirely inaccessible, except through the propaganda prism of Soviet newspapers. It is also Jewish New Year. I, as a young teenager, have no idea about this holiday. Notably, my birth certificate and the school records explicitly state that I'm Jewish. My great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents know about the Jewish holiday, but they say nothing to me. My family, my parents, and my younger sister wake up early on Saturday because school and most workplaces are open 6 days a week, and attendance on Saturday is as mandatory as on Monday. They're getting ready in our very small 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment, but it's close to luxurious by Soviet standards, where apartment shortages have not been resolved even in 70 years after the revolution. Many people still live in so-called kommunalki, with an apartment containing several rooms, one kitchen, and each room is occupied by a whole family, sometimes 3 generations. So grandparents, parents, and a child are in one room. There are imagine 3-4 rooms, 1 bathroom, 1 kitchen. At school, there is usual political information segment where we hear from our teacher and from our own reports based on newspapers about the unparalleled achievements of the party and advancement of socialist ideals and the decay of the capitalist West. On the way home, I stop by the store in the hope that there may be some bread or milk, but frequently the shelves are empty. And it's only because my dad typically runs to the store at 6 in the morning before, as soon as it opens and before he gets ready for work, that we still have some leftovers. In the evening, we may watch some TV. There are only 3 channels, all state-run. And since we all love ballet and go to the opera house in Odessa, which is splendid, you may get lucky and catch some production of Bolshoi on TV. This happens on weekends, or when there is some minor party turmoil, such as the leader passing away and the successor not yet being chosen. And then the Swan Lake is on all day. So now let's talk about some themes that come out of that day in life. One is censorship. So the party ruled and controlled every aspect of life. To achieve that, it engaged, it imposed censorship, suppressing ideas that would challenge it. After the revolution, all the monuments were taken down and all street names were changed to party leaders or events associated with the revolution. Could not even get a job or even education unless one showed that one's background is from workers' family. Bourgeois, farmers, let alone aristocrats, were entirely excluded at the time and had no option. Their property was forcefully confiscated, they were evicted from their homes, and many shot during the revolution and subsequent civil war. So then, while aristocrats were eradicated, the perpetual boogeyman was the bourgeois. That definition changed as it suited the party, but it was expression of any preference or values that might be viewed as adverse to socialism and building of communism. Then you're labeled bourgeois, and therefore really bad things happen to you. So books, plays, ballet, classical music had to be explicitly approved by the party personnel who censored anything that could be viewed as bourgeois. People could be entirely banned from their professions. There were films and books that were so-called shelved, and creators were on blacklists and were thrown out of their jobs. And because all jobs were state-controlled, there was no private enterprise, they could not get another job, and then they were criminally prosecuted for truancy. So that's certainly a disincentive for voicing any opposition. Some were mercifully kicked out of the country, such as Brodsky, but that's a good example, as the regime decided his poetry didn't comply with socialist realist norms, and their works did not appear until after perestroika. And because everything was state-controlled, there was no means of distribution of information other than through the state. In later years, in 70s and 80s, a concept of sum is that, which is typing up one book at a time and passing it to trusted friends, emerged, but it was very limited and dangerous because anyone could denounce you to KGB. After perestroika and the Soviet Union fell apart, many monuments from pre-revolution were restored and names changed back. And religious institutions acquired huge influence despite 70 years of repression. We'll talk about the role of religion later. There was obviously no freedom of press and could not even express any opinions that were inconsistent with the party line of the day. Couldn't even tell children anything lest they say something in school, as teachers were required to report anything troubling to the party chiefs in school who were part of the KGB. And so here the poster is the Communist Party is the leading force of the Soviet society, hail to the Communist Party, peace to the world, people and party are one. So that's essentially it, like whatever party says is what matters. So the next one is, we're talking about censorship still, and we have this young boy, his name was Pavlik Morozov. It's a fascinating story that became a required reading for every child in elementary school. During the Civil War, according to the story, his father was hoarding or hid some goods, some supplies for the family, rather than giving it up to the collective farm and to the party. And so guess what Pavlik did? He went to party leaders and he informed on his father, who was trying to keep his family alive. And so, of course, during the time, during collectivization, all individual farms were taken over and aggregated under party control. And so this boy was celebrated. This was one of the foundational myths. He's a hero, an example of true patriotism. And that was so through perestroika time. And as I said, we all read it in elementary school more than once. And the poster here says that we should all strive to be worthy of this poor boy. So there was total brainwashing and therefore willingness to sacrifice. And there was no access to what is outside during the existence of the country. The shortcut, for everything was in the name of brighter future. And that was the justification for any deprivation and crimes against people, that we're building brighter tomorrow. Of course, there was no internet at the time, but also could not subscribe or get access to international newspapers. We were behind the Iron Curtain. And if the party newspapers even express some nuance deviating from the party line, not even criticizing, but just saying something slightly different, the editor of the newspaper was removed immediately. I mentioned earlier the concept of politinformacja, political information. So my mom, as I said, was a teacher of French, but she also was a grade advisor. And the way it worked in the Soviet times, one grade, starting from first grade, there were usually about 30 kids. They all take the same classes from first grade until graduation. There's very small exceptions. There was home economics, boys and girls were taught different things, and there were small language classes. So despite being French teacher, she had at least once a week to update the class about politics based solely on party newspapers. And all teachers after work had to attend mandatory 2 to 3 hour meetings where they took role, where somebody was leading the discussion about the latest party announcements and what is the latest party line. And then you have to transmit that along with whatever newspapers say to your students. My mom once listened to the French radio, which was illegal and generally impossible because the signal was blocked most of the time, but sometimes it got through. And she told students about some civil rights movement in the United States without any advocacy, just basically relating some factual information. Somebody overheard and complained to the school director, who told her that she should never do that, let alone provide any information that is not in party newspapers. So the next aspect of life is education propaganda. And here it says, the goal is to be educated, which, of course, sounds wonderful. We all got a lot of education and we all prize it. But in the Soviet Union, so education was not about fun, it was hard work. And if a child said, I do not want to go to school, parents were supposed to say, we go to work and this is your work. And that starts to synthesize kids of primacy of work. Under the Soviet constitution, it is both a right and an obligation to work. And as I mentioned previously, if somebody was kicked out of their job and of course couldn't get another job because the state would refuse to hire them, then they're prosecuted for truancy. So this is where right and obligation kind of intersect and lead to horrible results. The Soviet schools were pretty intense, at least as far as, teaching reading and basic math, and everybody knew how to do that by certain grades. There were standard exams for each republic, and then they were further standardized in the Soviet Union on countrywide level, and you go to school 6 days a week. The history of Communist Party and political economy were mandatory in college regarding of major. And there were mandatory exams for those and for admission to further education, such as master's, PhD, again, regardless of the subject you were pursuing. And the one constant in the Soviet history was the portrait of Lenin, Marx, and Engels. And they were these three portraits, or one portrait depicting all three of them, were in every single room in non-private space. So, all right. So something like that. But otherwise, history was being constantly rewritten and republished, and you had to follow along. So here's the Photoshop in action in Stalin's time. As former colleagues and enemies were eliminated, their picture were erased, with only Stalin left at the end. Likewise, once Khrushchev was forced out, his portrait was out the next day. And the books had to have sheets literally torn out, and then they were republished. But you had to immediately make changes that the party mandated. And party influence started very early. From daycare, like pre-kindergarten, we had portraits of Lenin, and songs and verses that kids learned were about glorification of party and Lenin. And of course, that horrible story about Pavlik Morozov and how we should all aspire to be like him. So as part of this indoctrination, we were supposed to view Lenin as our eternal grandfather, the one who will always be there for us. Hence the poster which proclaims that Lenin lived, lives, and will live. Learning about revolution, party's leadership, and its own encompassing role in communist movements was absolutely required. And then starting in elementary school and you progress through high school, one had to be a member of the appropriate age group led by the party. They were called октябрята, пионеры, комсомольцы. There were no exceptions, and classes and activities in school were suffused with being also part of that group. That entailed learning about the party, participating in propaganda undertakings, and generally had a lot of rituals that functioned in essentially supplanting religion. The faith in Communist Party had to be absolute. The next step was becoming a party member, and that typically happened only post-college, but it was a much more exclusive club. And but generally, there was this military patriotic upbringing that was propagated by school. There were military political leaders in every school. Army was mandatory after high school, so military education started from a very young age. One always had to be ready to defend one's homeland. And if one didn't join the party, or one wanted and couldn't, very limited options essentially were for your career, because most leadership and managerial positions required party membership. And the labor union, called Profsоюз, was a branch of the party. There could never have been a conflict between the two. Of course, HR was just another outpost of KGB, and anybody who expressed disagreement with the party line, it's called other thinking, basically got in trouble with the KGB. So the next aspect is propaganda to the outsiders. What you see on the slide are people from different parts of the world, and they're all, about peace and friendship. So, as you may know, Soviet Union financed communist parties and labor movements all around the world. And leftist intelligentsia from Western Europe and US was invited to the Soviet Union and shown grand construction projects that were supposed to impress it and to show how well socialism was functioning. One notorious example is Belomor Canal. That's the canal that connects the White Sea and Baltic Sea. Well, the problem was that it resulted in just humongous toll and was built by death toll by political prisoners. So the beginning and ending labor force was 126,000. And according to the official records, between 12 and 25,000 people died. But Alexander Solzhenitsyn suggests in his work and other research that about 250,000 people died, so kind of double the workforce. But leftist Western intelligentsia were very impressed with the ideas and only talked about brighter future, and obviously either did not know or did not want to know about the actual cost of the population. Children were used in propaganda endeavors well, and my own experience is illustrative. So I was in school where French was taught from the first grade, and so we had this international club, and so some of us were specifically chosen and prepped to meet with French-speaking delegations which came to the Soviet Union as tourists. But they visited only designated places. Obviously, they couldn't roam free, and they were, meeting with us under very strict supervision. There was lots of preparation as to what we had to say. First of all, we had to say that we have everything. Our life is wonderful, and we lack for nothing. And the souvenirs that were brought to us, postcards, maybe perfume, maybe something, were immediately turned over to the authorities. So they said tourists could only come in groups and take into approved places. They could meet people, but they were selected by the party and KGB. And then these people reported back to the KGB the entirety of the conversation. They were even shown some historical sites, such as this chapel drawn by Vruble. but they were guarded by military in plain clothes without even knowing that. And the chapel was shown to tourists only, but again, as part of this farce, the impression was given that it's open to all people. So my mom actually had very interesting experience. When she was in college, she worked part-time. She tried to work part-time as a tour guide for French-speaking delegations. She had a Canadian delegation coming from Quebec, and she was taking them around and to all the places that were allowed. And then a couple of days in, my mom was told, "Where is your daily report?" And mom was like, "What do you mean?" And essentially, they were expecting her to provide daily reports to KGB regarding every conversation she had with people and whatever people were saying. So my mom refused to do that, and that was her one and only delegation. But interestingly, maybe because she wasn't providing reports, my mom is still friends with those people 40 years later, and they visit each other in the US and Canada. But at the time, after that trip, people in those delegations came back to Canada, and they would send letters on occasion to talk about their families, nothing political. And sometimes they would send little packages, let's say with chocolate. So the letters were always open. They didn't always arrive, but when they arrived, it was very clear there was KGB was not pretending that the letters were not read. You get an empty, you get a ripped off part of the envelope, this letter stuffed in. And then with chocolate, somebody from KGB would actually bite off like a piece of every chocolate just to show that they are in control. So that's the delights of socialism. So the next issue is inequality. Of course, as I mentioned, the concept of equality is very appealing to many. And what you see on the slide is that life is much better proportionately after the revolution, and that it gave female worker and peasant library and kindergarten, workers' club and school, etc. In reality, planned economy was all about attempt to exercise total control. So from number of ballistic missiles to literally number of socks that were going to be produced for the entire country and in which color. So at the time, everybody was asked to be like Stakhanov. So who is Stakhanov that was so pushed by the party? He was a Russian Soviet miner. He was a hero of socialist labor that was awarded in 1970, and of course, member of the Communist Party. He became a celebrity in 1935 as part of what became known as the Stakhanovite movement. It was a campaign intended to increase worker productivity and to demonstrate the superiority of the socialist economic system. Purportedly, he had mined a record of 102 tons of coal in 5 hours and 45 minutes, 14 times his quota. The idea was that 5-year plans need to be fulfilled in less time, so typically 4. And here you have a stamp commemorating Stakhanov's movement. Yesterday's innovator, frontier, today workers' norm. But it is impossible, especially with incentives and infrastructure completely lacking. So in the late 70s and 80s, during the time of economic stagnation, people quietly recognized that this is just not the reality. And so permanent deficits of all basic necessities, including food and housing, and remember communality, those horrid apartments where multiple generations had one room. And citizens, according to a common saying, pretended to work while the government pretended to pay them. And so before 1913, for instance, Russia was one of the biggest exporters of grain. But after the revolution, due to civil war and collectivization, there was always a lack of food products in stores, except in special party stores, and we'll talk about those. So Soviet Union had to import grain from United States and Canada because Soviet Union destroyed its own agriculture. And my grandfather, who was a military engineer, brought food products from military bases in Moldova, which was neighboring republic. But party elites had special stores because you have to get party going, keep the party going. And they had some very some Western bought products at very low prices. They were also special hospitals for party elites, and best, which is Western bought equipment, went there. My grandma was a doctor in a military sanatorium, and it looked absolutely nothing like the facilities for ordinary people. For regular people, which is practically everyone, it was a very sorry state of medicine. Even though it was purportedly available to everyone and one didn't have to pay anything or some very minimal amount, it was terribly hard to get an appointment. There were no readily available medications, even of kind that, you know, over the counter here. And hospital conditions were just terrible. And everybody knew it, it was not hidden. But, you know, Party had its own special hospitals, it had special resorts, it had special summer camps for promising young students who were going to become party members eventually, etc. And likewise, and relatedly to being a party member, the government subsidized military complex and certain marquee propaganda efforts. And ballet and sports are such examples, as you know, Soviet teams frequently got many gold medals at various Olympiads. Of course, there's a separate issue of maybe doping, but you know, there was definitely lots of resources put into that, something that's visible to the outsiders and that can present Soviet Union in a positive light. And so these people were given better benefits, basically, than what is equal access, which is what regular people get. Okay, so this slide is about voting. It says, "All to the elections, all people's celebration of our free motherland." And you see people looking all happy and cheerful here. Well, in the Soviet Union, there was one party, there were no primaries, there was one candidate, so the only choice was whether to vote at all. But in reality, it wasn't even a choice because voting was mandatory. In my mom's experience, as a teacher, she got assigned 2 streets near school. She had to write every person's name from high-rise buildings where they lived and for voting in advance. And the day of, she went to the precinct, checked who voted, and those who didn't, she had to go back and like literally beg people to vote because it was her responsibility. And if she didn't fulfill it, she could have been fired. And the goal was always that the voter turnout be about 99.23% because, of course, party recognized that some people might be in a hospital, but basically you vote for the only available candidate. There were also meetings with candidates, but what happened during those meetings are their constituents, so to say, were begging for apartments because there was such perpetual shortage of those. Okay, so religion and religious discrimination, that's a big topic, but here what you see on the slides is away with religious holidays. And of course, like you see those people who are not looking particularly savory. And of course, we want to get rid of those people as they're associated somehow with religion. There was no practicing religion. There was still some churches and like a synagogue, but their heads were appointed and overseen by the KGB. Everybody had to be KGB informants. And that was to exercise whatever residual control over people that party didn't quite capture. But as a general matter, religion was seen as an opium for people, and very few even dared to attend a place of religion. So here it says religion is poison and take care of kids. And we have, church on one side, and then it says on the right, it says shkol, which is school. So the child is trying to get to school and the evil grandmother is trying to point to the church. So we'll talk about our own experience of being Jewish. In the Soviet Union, it was viewed as a nationality, not religion. So your birth certificate, your passport, and the class journal with everyone's name had Jewish written as your nationality. For others, it was Russian or Ukrainian. There was state discrimination against Jews. They were severely limiting or outright banning universities for admitting Jews to certain programs. or professional placements. And of course, the party assigned you to your job. You did not get free choice. There was one synagogue on the outskirts of Odessa, which had over 1 million population and very large Jewish population. My mom was told that if she so much as approaches it, she will never be able to work again, because if one attends a synagogue, one is bound to spread Zionist lies to students. And indeed, as you can see from the poster, school and religion were viewed as mutually exclusive. My great-grandfather was a rabbi before the revolution, but I did not know it until we came to the United States. My great-grandparents spoke Yiddish among themselves and covertly celebrated high holidays, but nobody would tell me, and the family pretended that they were speaking in Kazakh language and the holidays, and were celebrating Kazakh holidays because my great-grandparents were in Kazakhstan during the evacuation in World War II. So it was okay to speak another republic's language, but not Yiddish or Hebrew. And the reason they didn't tell me is that the danger they were guarding against is that I do not mention it to my friends or teachers in school, who would then go to KGB and denounce such practices, which would result in everybody going to prison. So in sum, all had access to education, medicine. There was right of access. Right of access was the same, but to get better service, one had to be a party member. To get a better doctor, to get a test you need, to skip years of line of waiting. But potentially, again, it was equality. Everybody had right of access. And when we came to the US, we were ready to work hard, and my parents had multiple jobs and worked overtime. But lots of people prefer to know that their very basic needs are met without much input on their end. But that also means that people have no incentive to work, and the whole economic system was based on the lowest common denominator. So the difference between an engineer and genius inventor was negligible. There was no private enterprise or initiative. And remember, the state and the party was one and the same, and they had control over all the information from inside and outside. And so these are kind of like three takeaways. Oppression and censorship are essential part of how socialism functioned. And there were perpetual shortages that made life miserable for pretty much everyone. And you couldn't get any information about outside. So that was life under socialism.
Great. Well, молодец, хорошо. I mean, I want to say thank you so much for again, talking, for giving us the overlay, and then for going into some of your personal experience and so on. I imagine it's also very moving for some of our members, again, who are more Soviet background and Soviet Jewish background and so on. Is definitely very interesting. I was hoping along the way, when you mentioned, the KGB, I was thinking you might say it's familiar to us through what the NSA and FBI are doing in this country, which is rather.
Oh, not even close, not even close. It's, I mean, that's, I think people truly, the reason I did like this day in life and is because there are many parallels one can draw, but one truly cannot grasp how all-encompassing the control was. And there were just no alternatives. And so any movement kind of in that direction, this is where you end up. If you're not careful, if you don't have safeguards, if you don't have balance of power, if you don't have like rules that actually limit various authorities, this is what you end up. You just go towards absolutism. That's only limited by their enforcement powers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I want to hone in on some of the legal questions. But one thing I wanted to mention, and I'm sure other people may have questions along the way, of course, is some of the foreign leaders who they brought in on the leader visiting program. Of course, notably Bernie Sanders, and also Ted Kennedy famously went to the Soviet Union as part of, and had the specialized focus tour of only visiting the very successful sites and only, seeing essentially the Potemkin villages and seeing the good things.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's, yeah. And, on a smaller scale is what I was describing with tourists coming, and that's what, my mom was showing them around, or like French tourists coming to Odessa, because there was this concept of sister cities. So I forget which one was Sister City was dozen, but they would come and they would be shown all the pretty things. They would talk to cheerful children who have absolutely everything, and of course they do not need your souvenirs or tasty treats. We have plenty of everything ourselves. But yeah, I mean, it was so much for the show, because the reality was abominable for every day for people.
Yeah. And I just wanted to mention again on the legal side, I mean, I mentioned earlier that there were codes. There was a criminal code and a civil code and also a labor code in terms of the top-down structure. And there were a series of constitutions in the Soviet Union that broadly defined class rights and class protections rather than individual rights and individual protections. And so, of course, you having had the experience of, again, essentially being in the temple of our Constitution and our democracy, clerking on the Supreme Court and so on, I imagine that being therefore at the heart of our kind of individual rights oriented and liberal order, I'm wondering if you could comment upon again how some of those experiences, or do sort of a compare and contrast on how those earlier experiences growing up in a highly collectively identified society compared to, again, looking at protections for individual rights in Supreme Court cases that you may have touched on or worked on.
Well, I mean, of course, as I mentioned, let's just take First Amendment, both speech and religion, right? Like, there is nothing you can say in the Soviet Union that is not a party line, or you risk ending up in prison or, dismissed from your job at best and then unable to find another job. Or religion, right? Like, as you mentioned in the introduction, one of the reasons I do tons of work on free exercise and establishment clauses, some of it pro bono, some is not, and representing various religious institutions. And I do that precisely because I know what it's like to live without those protections. And, here, of course, like, I've done cases on ministerial exception and on a variety of other things about just what kind of issues courts can meddle in. And I remember in actually one of the briefs, I think in the Supreme Court amicus brief, in one of the ministerial exception cases, we were saying, well, in the US, the state cannot meddle with leadership positions in religious organizations, and religious organization figures out for itself who will teach, who will decide what tenets of its faith are. But in the Soviet Union, you have officials, the state actually appointing who is the head of the church or the synagogue. And that's an enormous contrast, of course. And so a lot of my work in this area is directly because what I grew up with and what my family was deprived of. And so it's very important to me that I can do something here to protect those rights, because they do exist, and they're obviously, and as you know, in the last several years, the Supreme Court has made many excellent decisions in the First Amendment religion clauses area, and so it's great to be participating in this and in trying to advance those ideals.
Yeah. George didn't want to tell me to potentially move towards wrapping things up here, because we again want to respect your time and so on. But one other contrast that I just wanted to focus on and bring out for people here is also the nature of property law, which is part of where we brought it, which is part of the philosophical linchpin, again, of Marxism-Leninism, is focusing on property law, focusing on collective rather than individual identity. And so instead of how under any capitalist or frankly bourgeois system, how we have distinctions between state-owned property and corporately owned property and then individually owned property. They also had a tripart distinction between state-owned property, which may have been most of the property, and then collectively owned property through unions, collective farms, things like this, and then just personal property. And so I'm wondering how significant this was sort of on a daily basis in terms of growing up, how closely this distinction between union property, collective factory or farm property, how much this was on your mind, how present this was?
Well, that's a great question. I think the reality is that the state ownership collapsed or rather swallowed up any labor or union or whatever like ownership. It was all part of the state. So as I mentioned, the labor union is an outpost of the party. So when it says like, oh, the factory is owned by the people, no, the state owns it. You have like no stake whatsoever. All you get as a factory worker is your salary that the state pays you. You have absolutely no rights in any way. So that was just a work of fiction, of legal fiction. On the individual level, there were so many shortages that there is not much to own. Like, what can you own even, right? Like, you're hoping to find, groceries and maybe like socks and some horrendous color that the party decreed. But again, like, people lived in those tiny apartments, sharing them. And again, they did not have a title to the apartments. Everything belonged to the state. So if you live in an apartment, it's because the state gave it to you and you pay some nominal rent. But, it's not clear that it necessarily would pass on to your heirs. In reality, it did, I think, in most instances. But, I think the overall, that regime created shortages and absolute disconnect between people's needs and what was being produced. The money was being spent on military-industrial complex to compete with the US or, prop up some regimes around the world that were friendly to the Soviet Union. So yeah, the property, there was very, very little property for individuals to possess or enjoy. Whatever existed was because the state gave you an opportunity to enjoy it, but it was retractable at any moment. So again, very different from here with the concept of property rights.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Dorfman, for that incredible presentation. Does anyone else have any last-minute questions before we wrap up? I know it was very detailed and you went through it a lot, so I really appreciate it. And we're very lucky to host you.
Well, thank you so much.
On behalf of FedSoc, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for being here. And that concludes our speaker programming for this month. It doesn't really say much given it's the last week, but I think we ended on a really great speaker. So thank you everyone. And thank you again, Ms. Dorfman.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for inviting me and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.